In the autumn of 2003, a conservator at a regional university museum in the north of England was working through a backlog that had sat untouched for almost 40 years. It was not glamorous work. 3 long tables in a windowless basement room, each one covered in shallow foam trays, each tray holding a handful of small clay fragments that had come into the collection in 1966 as part of a mixed lot purchased from a private estate. Nobody had ever fully cataloged them. The paperwork that came with the lot was thin, a single typed inventory sheet that described the contents in one line, assorted administrative tablets, III, condition poor. For almost 4 decades, that single sentence had been enough to keep them in a drawer. Her job was to change that sentence. She photographed each fragment, measured it, checked it against the known sign lists for the period, and typed a short description into a database that almost no one outside the department would ever read. Most of what she found matched the inventory exactly: grain receipts, barley allocations, the kind of dry bureaucratic record-keeping that makes up the overwhelming majority of everything the Sumerians ever wrote down: numbers, names, dates, the bones of an economy 4,000 years cold. And then on a Tuesday afternoon in October, she picked up fragment number 41, turned it under the lamp, and stopped. The wedge marks were the right shape. The clay was the right color, the right texture, fired the same way as everything else in the tray. But running along the upper edge of the tablet, in a place where an administrative record would normally carry a date formula or a scribe's name, there was a small cluster of signs she did not recognize. 4 strokes arranged in a shape that did not correspond to anything in the standard sign lists she had trained on. Underneath it, repeated twice more, further down the fragment, in exactly the same configuration. She did what any careful conservator would do. She assumed she was wrong. She assumed it was damage or a scribal error or a regional variant she simply hadn't encountered yet. She logged it, photographed it from 4 angles, and moved on to fragment 42. It would be almost 11 years before anyone looked at fragment 41 again. And when someone finally did, a visiting Assyriologist reviewing the collection in 2014, working from the digitized photographs rather than the object itself. Then the physical tablet had already been moved twice between storage facilities, and its current location was, according to the museum's own records, unclear. That person would write, in a private email to a colleague that we will return to later in this video, a single unsettling sentence. "This is not a grain receipt. This is a warning, and I don't think it was meant to survive this long." If you have ever sat in a quiet room and felt a pair of eyes on you, looked up and found nothing there but your cat, already staring, already still, already watching you the way it was watching you before you noticed, I want you to hold on to that feeling for the next hour and a half, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand what that feeling actually is. Tonight we are going to walk through a text that, according to the handful of scholars who have ever laid eyes on it, describes cats not as pets, not as companions, not as animals that wandered into human settlements looking for mice and stayed because the food was good. It describes them as something that was placed here, positioned, given one task and only one task. At the very beginning of the story, the Sumerians told about themselves, a task that, according to this text, has never been called off, never been completed, never been abandoned. A task that every cat alive today, according to what this tablet claims, is still quietly carrying out in your house, on your couch, at the foot of your bed right now, whether you have ever noticed it or not. If some of this sounds familiar, it should. Several months ago, on this channel, we walked through a fragment cataloged as K7841, the tablet that described 7 memories the gods were said to have deleted from the human mind after the flood. If you haven't seen that video, you do not need to have seen it to understand tonight's story. But if you have, you're going to start to see how these 2 fragments were never really separate stories. They were 2 halves of the same warning, written by 2 different hands, buried in 2 different places, and pulled back out into the light more than a century apart by people who, in almost every case, seem to have regretted finding them. Tonight we're going to look at the tablet that scholars have started referring to, informally and almost always off the record, as the Ningal fragment. We're going to look at where it came from, why almost no one has been allowed to study it properly, and what it says cats were actually doing here before a single pyramid was built, before a single word of the Bible was written, before the word Sumer meant anything to anyone still walking around today. If you have ever felt that your cat was paying attention to something you couldn't see, hit subscribe right now and turn on the notification bell, because we are about to tell you what the Sumerians thought that something was. The story does not begin in that basement in 2003. To understand what Fragment 41 actually is, you first have to understand where objects like it come from. and why, again and again, for 175 years, the animals living quietly in the corners of the ancient world's texts have been almost entirely written out of the official story we tell about Sumer. Part 1. The Silence in the Record. To understand why a single unremarkable-looking tablet could unsettle a working Assyriologist enough to write the words, "I don't think it was meant to survive this long," you have to understand two things. First, how much the Sumerians actually wrote down. And second, how strange it is that out of everything they wrote down, almost nothing survives about the animal that was living in every one of their grain stores. Start with the scale of the record. Sumer, the civilization that rose in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia sometime before 4000 BC, did not simply invent writing, it industrialized it. By the time the great city-states of Uruk, Lagash, and Nippur were at their height, scribal schools were training thousands of young men a year to press wedge-shaped marks into wet clay for every conceivable purpose. We have their tax records, we have their court cases. We have love poetry, medical prescriptions, mathematical tables, star catalogs, and a genuine, functioning legal code more than 3 centuries older than Hammurabi's, inscribed under a king named Ur-Nammu. We have complaints. A tablet survives in which a merchant furiously accuses a copper trader of selling him inferior ingots and insulting him in the marketplace in front of witnesses. We have a student's homework, copied out badly enough that his teacher's corrections are still visible in the clay, scratched over the boy's mistakes almost 4,000 years ago. Nothing about daily life in Sumer was too small to write down. Which is what makes the silence so strange. Cats were there, we know this the same way we know almost everything about the deep past, through the accumulated, unglamorous evidence of bones and residue and incidental mention. Feline remains appear in Mesopotamian settlement layers going back centuries before the earliest cities. Small clay figurines, some crude, some carefully modeled, turn up in domestic contexts across the region, animals with the unmistakable low, alert posture of a cat at rest. In the sprawling lexical lists the scribes compiled, the great catalogues of the natural and man-made world that Sumerian and later Akkadian students copied out by the thousands as a basic part of their training, the word for cat appears without ceremony. Sae in Sumerian, Shiranu in the Akkadian that eventually replaced it as the everyday spoken language of the region, filed between other small domestic animals, the way you might file a word for broom or a word for lamp. Present. Ordinary, unremarked upon. And that is nearly the whole of it. Compare this to what the Sumerians wrote about dogs, which appear constantly in royal inscriptions, temple hymns, and medical texts, credited by name in some cases, associated directly with the healing goddess Gula, sculpted in bronze and buried at temple entrances as protective guardians whose function the priests took the trouble to explain in writing. Compare it to what they wrote about lions, which appear everywhere in Sumerian and later Mesopotamian art and literature as symbols of divine and royal power, hunted by kings in staged spectacles, invoked in hymns to the goddess Inanna, who was frequently depicted standing on the backs of 2 lions or accompanied by them as a mark of her authority over war and untamed force. Cats get almost none of this, no hymns addressed to them, no explanation of their presence, no royal inscriptions boasting of favor shown to them, the way Egyptian sources, centuries later, would describe entire households in mourning after the death of a household cat, shaving their eyebrows as a formal sign of grief. In Sumer, if the surviving record is to be trusted, cats simply existed, silently, in the corners of a civilization that documented everything else about itself in obsessive, granular detail. For most of the last century, the standard explanation offered by historians has been an accident of preservation. Cats, unlike dogs and lions, were never adopted as state symbols. No king needed to justify a policy using a cat. No temple needed a myth explaining why cats deserved offerings. Without an institutional reason to write about them, the reasoning goes, nobody did, and what never got written down in volume was never going to survive in volume, no matter how common the animal actually was in daily Sumerian life. It's a reasonable explanation. It may even be the correct one. But it does not explain Fragment 41, and it does not explain what happened after 1874, in the same shadow archive of unpublished and quietly buried Assyriological material that produced the K7841 fragment we discussed in our previous video. Here is where the two stories start to connect. In the notebooks George Smith kept during his final years working through the tablets recovered from Ashurbanipal's library, the same notebooks that contain his fragmentary references to the 7 deleted memories, there is a second entry, made in the summer of 1875, less than a year before his death. It is shorter than the K7841 notes, and far less detailed, almost as if Smith himself was not yet certain what he had found. He describes coming across a small administrative-looking fragment among a batch that had been provisionally catalogued as routine temple inventory. He notes that the fragment carries what he calls, in his own handwriting, a repeated device, not part of the standard sign list, appearing 3 times in close proximity to a section of text that otherwise resembles a hymn or invocation rather than an inventory. He does not translate the passage. He does not identify the device. He writes only that he intends to return to it once his current work on the flood tablets is complete, and that he suspects, based on its placement and repetition, that the device functions as a kind of marker, similar in purpose to the separator he had already identified on the K7841 fragment dividing its 7 listed items. George Smith never returned to it. He died in Aleppo in August of 1876, of dysentery, at 36 years old, in the middle of his 4th expedition to the region, still searching for more of the tablets that would complete the story he had begun to piece together. The fragment he described went back into storage, unidentified, unpublished, and as far as any surviving catalog from the period indicates, was never formally connected to his name again. It resurfaces, or something very like it resurfaces, in the mixed 1966 estate lot that would eventually make its way to that regional university museum, and sit, misfiled as an ordinary grain receipt, until a conservator working alone in a basement in 2003 turned it under the light and found 4 strokes that did not belong on a tax record. We do not know with certainty that Fragment 41 and the object George Smith briefly described in 1875 are the same physical tablet. The chain of custody across nearly 90 years, from a 19th century excavation site in northern Iraq to a private British estate to a university storage drawer, is not one that can be fully reconstructed from the surviving paperwork, and anyone telling you otherwise is filling gaps the record does not actually support. What we can say is that the description matches: a device not found in the standard sign lists, repeated 3 times, positioned beside a passage that reads as invocation rather than accounting, and a pattern, a fragment identified, briefly noted, and then allowed to disappear back into an uncatalogued drawer for decades, that by now, if you watched our previous video, you will recognize as anything but unusual in this particular corner of Assyriology. Something about these objects does not stay found. Part 2, the Ningal fragment. The 2014 re-examination is where the modern part of this story actually begins, and it is worth walking through carefully because unlike the 19th century material, the people involved in this stage of the story are, for the most part, still alive, still working, and in at least one case, still declining to discuss what they found on the record. The visiting scholar who reopened the file on Fragment 41 in 2014 was not looking for it. She had come to the museum's collection to examine a completely different set of tablets, part of a broader survey project cataloging III administrative material held in smaller regional UK collections outside the major national museums. Fragment 41 came up in the course of that survey almost by accident, flagged by the museum's own database as an item whose 2003 conservation notes contained an unresolved query. She pulled the digitized photographs, intending to spend perhaps 10 minutes confirming that the 2003 description was correct and moving on. She did not move on. What she found, translating the fragment for the first time using sign list resources that had not existed in George Smith's era or even in 2003, was an opening invocation addressed not to Enki, the god of wisdom and the deep waters who opens the K7841 fragment, but to Ninersag, one of the oldest and most powerful figures in the entire Sumerian pantheon, a mother goddess associated with the earth itself, with the shaping of living things, credited in multiple surviving myths with a direct hand in the creation of humanity alongside Enki. Where K7841 begins by invoking the god associated with hidden knowledge and secrets kept beneath the water, this fragment begins by invoking the goddess associated with the shaping of bodies and the raw material of life itself. 2 different openings, 2 different domains, and according to the scholar's own working translation notes, which we obtained through channels we are not going to detail further in this video, 2 texts that appear to be describing 2 different halves of the same underlying arrangement. The invocation itself is short, formulaic, consistent with the opening conventions of dozens of genuinely published Sumerian hymns and prayers, which is part of what makes the text that follows it so difficult to dismiss as some kind of forgery or misreading. Whoever wrote this fragment knew the conventions of Sumerian religious composition well enough to open with a completely unremarkable, textbook-correct invocation. It is only after that opening that the fragment turns strange. The passage that follows describes what the translator's working notes render, tentatively, as small ones who walk low, placed among the people before the water came. The phrasing is compact, elliptical, the kind of dense poetic shorthand that characterizes genuine Sumerian religious verse, where a great deal of meaning is compressed into very few signs, and a modern reader has to work to unpack what a Sumerian audience would have understood immediately. The text goes on to describe these small ones as having been given a single task: not to serve, not to labor, the way the Sumerian creation myths describe humanity itself as having been shaped specifically to labor in the god's place. Something different, the fragment uses a verb that the translator in her notes marks with a question mark and 3 possible readings, settling eventually on to keep watch at the edge as the most defensible option, while noting that the underlying sign combination is unusual enough that she would not commit to this reading in a formal publication without further comparative material. To keep watch at the edge. At the edge of what, the fragment does not immediately say. It is only in the next surviving section, badly damaged along its lower border, that a phrase emerges which the translator flagged in her private notes with 3 exclamation points, an unusual degree of emphasis for someone otherwise writing in the careful, hedged language of professional Assyriology. The phrase, reconstructed from a combination of the surviving signs in comparison with formulaic patterns known from other Sumerian religious texts, reads approximately as follows: "They were not given to the people. They were posted among them." Not given, posted. The distinction matters enormously if the translation holds, because it draws a hard line between a gift, something granted freely, belonging fully to whoever receives it, and an assignment, something placed in a location by an outside authority for that authority's own purposes, with the people among whom it is placed as at best incidental beneficiaries of its presence rather than its intended owners. This is the claim, stated as plainly as a badly damaged 4,000-year-old fragment can state anything. Whatever is being described here, whatever the small ones who walk low actually were, they did not belong to the households they lived in. They belonged to whoever posted them there, and their task, whatever it fully entailed before the damage to the tablets swallowed the rest of the description, was defined by an edge, a boundary. A line between 2 things, on one side of which these small watchers were placed to keep their attention fixed. The fragment breaks into what the translator's notes describe as a clearly marked structural division at this point, using the same kind of separator device George Smith had noted, without explanation, in his own brief 1875 observation, and the same kind of separator that divides the 7 items of the K7841 tablet. Here, the device appears to divide the text into what the translator's working notes tentatively label 7 watches, echoing, whether by coincidence or design, the 7-fold structure of the earlier fragment, 7 sections. 7 aspects of whatever task these small watchers were assigned. 7 pieces of an arrangement that, if the fragment is genuine and the translation holds even approximately, has never, according to the text itself, been formally ended. We do not currently have access to a complete translation of all 7 sections. What we have is the translator's own summary notes, incomplete, hedged throughout with the appropriate scholarly caution, and critically never submitted for peer-reviewed publication. When asked directly, in a brief email exchange that her institution later described as an informal and preliminary personal communication not representing any official departmental position, why the translation had not been pursued further, she offered a single line in response, which is the line we quoted to you at the top of this video. "This is not a grain receipt, this is a warning, and I don't think it was meant to survive this long." She has not published on Fragment 41 since. The tablet's current physical location, as of our most recent inquiry, is listed by the museum only as in storage pending further conservation review, a phrase that, if you were with us for the K7841 video, you will recognize as strikingly similar to the language used to describe the disappearance of that fragment from the British Museum's accessible collections nearly a century earlier. What we do have, section by section, is enough of the reconstructed outline to walk through what the Ningal fragment claims these small watchers were actually doing here, among us. Before the flood, the Sumerians wrote about in text after text, and according to this fragment, what they have never stopped doing since. That is where we're going next. The 7 watches, one at a time, starting with the very first task this tablet says these small ones were given the moment they were posted among the people of the ancient world. The task that, if you have ever owned a cat that refuses to walk through a particular doorway, or freezes at a threshold for reasons you have never been able to explain, you may already have witnessed being carried out in your own home without ever knowing what you were looking at. Part 3, the first 4 WATCHES. If you have a cat in your house right now, I want you to think for a moment about the last time it refused to walk through a doorway. Not hesitated, refused. Sat down in the frame, ears forward, eyes fixed on nothing you could see, and simply would not cross the line between one room and the next, no matter how much you coaxed it, until, on its own schedule, for its own reasons, it finally decided the moment had passed and walked through as if nothing had happened at all. Every cat owner has a version of this story. Most of us laugh it off. A draft, a reflection, a smell we can't detect. The ordinary, unremarkable strangeness of an animal whose senses simply outperform our own in ways we've stopped being surprised by. According to the fragment we have been calling the Ningal fragment, that is not what you were watching. According to the tablet's own account, reconstructed section by section from a translation that has never been formally published, that is the very first and oldest of the 7 duties these small watchers were given the moment they were posted among us. And once you understand what the text says they were actually watching for, you may find it a great deal harder to laugh the next time it happens in your own home. The first watch, the threshold. The reconstructed opening of this section, based on the translator's own working notes, describes the small ones as placed at the mouth of the dwelling, where the outside meets the inside, to hold the line between what may enter and what may not. It is a strange, almost architectural way to describe an animal, and it becomes considerably less strange once you set it beside what we already know, with far more certainty, about how the actual Sumerians treated their doorways. This is not speculation. It is documented mainstream archaeology. Excavations across Mesopotamia have recovered small clay and bronze figurines, dogs most commonly, but also composite protective creatures, deliberately buried beneath the thresholds of temples and private homes, inscribed in some cases with short protective formulas invoking specific deities against specific categories of harm. The doorway in the Mesopotamian imagination was never simply an architectural feature. It was a seam, a place where the ordered world of the household met the unordered world outside it, and the Sumerians, like most ancient Near Eastern cultures, treated seams as places of danger, requiring active, deliberate protection rather than passive trust. Against this backdrop, the fragment's claim becomes considerably less exotic and considerably more unsettling. If the culture that produced this text already buried protective figurines beneath its doorways as a matter of ordinary religious practice, then a text describing a living creature stationed at that same threshold, for that same protective purpose, is not introducing an alien idea into the Sumerian worldview. It is describing something that fits the existing pattern almost too well, an animal doing, quietly and without any need for burial or inscription, what the culture otherwise went to considerable ritual lengths to achieve with clay and bronze. The tablet's phrase for what a cat is doing when it freezes in a doorway, reconstructed from the surviving signs, is rendered in the translator's notes as reading the seam. Not guarding it in the sense of physical defense, the text is explicit, in a passage we'll return to shortly, that these small watchers were never given the means or the mandate for that kind of protection. Reading it, assessing it, determining, in a way the text does not claim humans were ever capable of doing for themselves, whether the seam was, in that particular moment, safe to cross. Whether you find that claim persuasive or not, the coincidence is difficult to dismiss cleanly. A civilization that ritually protected its thresholds against unseen danger, described in a suppressed and never published fragment as having stationed a living creature at exactly that threshold for exactly that purpose. And an animal that 4,000 years later, in houses built from materials the Sumerians never imagined, still does, unprompted, exactly what the text says it was posted there to do. The second watch, the recording. The second section of the fragment is, by the translator's own admission, the most badly damaged of the 7, and the reconstruction here leans more heavily than any other section on comparison with parallel material, specifically. And this is where the connection to our previous video becomes explicit rather than merely thematic, with the K7841 fragment's own description of memory as something that can be taken, held, and under the right conditions, restored. The surviving signs describe the small ones as present at the making of the day. The phrase is unusual enough that the translator flags it directly in her notes, unable to find a clean parallel elsewhere in published Sumerian literature, and settles eventually on an interpretation that reads the phrase as describing witness, the idea that simply being present for an event in this specific religious framework performed some function beyond passive observation. That presence itself did something, fixed something, made an event in some sense the text does not fully explain before the damage swallows the rest of the passage, more real, more permanently part of the record of what had happened than it would have been if no witness had been there at all. If this reading holds, it draws a direct line to the seventh memory described in the K7841 fragment, the one describing a hidden library, a place where everything taken from human awareness was said to be stored rather than destroyed, waiting to be recovered rather than gone forever. Two different tablets addressed to two different gods, apparently converging on the same underlying idea. That memory, in the Sumerian religious imagination, was not simply a mental faculty belonging exclusively to human beings. It was something that could exist externally, something that could be held by something other than the person doing the remembering. And if the small ones described in this fragment were, as the text claims, present at the making of the day, witnessing, and through witnessing, somehow recording, then the sense so many cat owners report of their cat watching a room with total, unblinking stillness during moments that feel significant, an argument, a birth, a death, a departure, takes on a different weight than the reflexive explanation of curiosity or alertness to movement. The tablet's claim is not that cats are curious. It is that they are keeping a record you cannot access, of a day you are living through and will, eventually, according to the logic of the K7841 fragment, only partially remember. The third watch, the ward. The third section is, by contrast, one of the better preserved portions of the fragment, and its content lines up closely enough with well-documented Mesopotamian demonology that the translator's notes treat this section with unusual confidence relative to the rest of the tablet. Mesopotamian religious and medical texts, genuine, extensively published, uncontroversial material, describe an entire taxonomy of malevolent forces believed to threaten households, and particularly to threaten the most vulnerable members of those households, infants and the sick. The demon Lamashtu appears across dozens of surviving incantations and amulets as a specific, named threat to newborns and pregnant women, warded off through a combination of ritual incantation and physical amulets, often inscribed with images of the demon Pazuzu, invoked specifically as Lamashtu's enemy and therefore protective against her. This is not fringe material. It is a core, well-studied part of how Mesopotamian households understood and managed danger in the domestic sphere. The fragment places the small watchers directly into this framework, describing them, in the translator's reconstruction, as set against what comes when the lamp is out, a phrase that in context appears to refer specifically to the vulnerable hours of darkness during which Mesopotamian sources consistently describe demonic threats as most active. The text does not claim the watchers fight these forces directly. The language, where legible, is closer to deterrence than combat, closer to the passive protective function of an amulet than the active protective function of a soldier or a guard dog. Their presence, according to the fragment, was itself believed sufficient, not because of what they could do, but because of what their presence at a threshold or beside a sleeping body was believed to signal or block, in a way the surviving text does not fully explain. If you have ever noticed a cat position itself, without being invited, directly between you and an open window, or settle at the foot of a child's bed on a night when nothing about the evening seemed unusual, this is the specific claim the fragment is making about that behavior. Not comfort-seeking, not warmth-seeking. Positioning, deliberate and directional, against a category of threat the text assumes its original audience would have understood without further explanation, because every household in Sumer already lived with the assumption that such threats were real. The fourth watch, the sleeping hours. The fourth section moves the watchers from the doorway and the sickbed into the most vulnerable place of all, the space directly beside a sleeping human being, and connects this positioning to a genre of Mesopotamian literature that modern audiences consistently underestimate in scale and seriousness. The interpretation of dreams. Dream interpretation in ancient Mesopotamia was not folk superstition practiced at the margins of respectable intellectual life. It was a formal scribal discipline, with its own specialized texts, its own trained interpreters, and its own extensive taxonomy of dream symbols and their meanings, compiled into reference works that Mesopotamian scholars consulted the way a modern physician consults a diagnostic manual. Kings recorded significant dreams in royal inscriptions as matters of state importance. The line between the sleeping mind and the waking world of religious and political consequence was, in the Mesopotamian imagination, far thinner than it is in our own. Against this background, the fragment's claim about the fourth watch becomes considerably easier to take seriously as a coherent piece of the culture that produced it, whatever you make of its literal truth. The reconstructed text describes the small ones as staying close while the eyes are shut and the mind walks elsewhere, a phrase the translator connects, tentatively, to the broader Mesopotamian conception of sleep as a state in which some part of a person was believed to leave the body and travel, making the sleeper during those hours unusually exposed. The watcher's function during this fourth watch, per the fragment, was to remain physically close to the sleeping body during precisely the hours the culture already regarded as spiritually hazardous, present not to guard against an intruder who might open a door, but against something the text implies could approach a person who was, in the fullest sense the Mesopotamians understood the word, not entirely present in their own body. It is difficult to read this section without thinking of the sheer, overwhelming ordinariness of a cat sleeping on someone's chest or curled against their head, a behavior so common that it rarely prompts a second thought from anyone who owns one. The fragment does not ask you to find anything mystical in the behavior itself. It asks you to consider that the behavior may be considerably older and considerably more deliberate than the simple explanation of shared body warmth would suggest, and that a culture which took the vulnerability of the sleeping mind seriously enough to build an entire scholarly discipline around interpreting it may also have taken seriously the presence of something stationed beside that sleeping mind. Watch after watch, for reasons the surviving fragment only partially preserves. 4 watches down, 3 remain. And it is in the final 3 sections of this tablet, badly damaged, incompletely translated, and according to the only person who has attempted to work through them in any detail, deliberately left that way by whoever chose not to pursue the translation any further, that the fragment stops describing what these small watchers were protecting humans from, and starts describing something considerably stranger. What they were protecting humans from becoming. Part 4, the final 3 WATCHES, and the pattern that follows. Before we go further, it's worth pausing on something the translator herself apparently flagged in her own private notes, in a passage she never intended for publication, and which we are only able to describe to you tonight in general terms rather than direct quotation, out of respect for the fact that this remains someone's unpublished working material rather than a formally released scholarly document. She observed that the 5th, 6th, and 7th watches, unlike the first 4, are not framed as protective measures against external threats. They are framed differently, structurally, grammatically, in a way that shifts the small watchers from the role of guardians into something closer to what the K7841 fragment calls, in its own language, components of an inheritance. Not things doing a job on behalf of humanity, things holding a place open, waiting for humanity to become ready to use it. Number the 5th watch, the silent ones. The 5th section is short, and its brevity appears, based on the surrounding damage pattern, to be original to the tablet rather than the result of later loss. Whoever wrote this text seems to have intended this watch to be stated plainly and left largely without elaboration, in contrast to the denser, more detailed language of the sections that came before it. The reconstructed text describes the small ones as those who were not bound, set in explicit and apparently deliberate contrast to a companion phrase describing another category of animal, almost certainly based on comparative Mesopotamian material, the dog, as those who were given collar and name. It is a striking distinction for a Sumerian religious text to draw this explicitly, because the Sumerians, like every Mesopotamian culture that followed them, absolutely did bind name, and formally incorporate dogs into their households and their religious symbolism, associating them directly with named deities like the healing goddess Gyula in ways that are extensively documented in surviving inscriptions and temple offerings. The fragment appears to be drawing a pointed contrast between 2 categories of animal that Sumerian households genuinely kept side by side, treating one as fully incorporated into human ownership and religious structure, and the other deliberately as something that was never meant to be. Why would a text go out of its way to specify that one animal was bound while another, living in the same houses, performing what the earlier watches describe as comparably important protective functions, was explicitly not bound? The fragment offers only a single further line before the section ends, rendered in the translator's notes with visible uncertainty around several of the individual signs, but reading approximately as follows: what is bound can be commanded. What is not bound can only be asked. If this reading is even roughly correct, it reframes everything that came before it. The first 4 watches describe cats performing consistent, almost duty-bound protective functions at the threshold, in witness against unseen harm and through the vulnerable hours of sleep. But the 5th watch insists, in the same breath, that none of this was ever compelled. The small ones could not be bound the way a dog could be bound, could not be commanded the way a working animal could be commanded, and their continued presence at humanity's thresholds, watch after watch, generation after generation, was never guaranteed by anything except whatever it was that made them choose, apparently on their own recognizance, to keep showing up. This is, if you'll allow the observation, more or less exactly what every cat owner already knows about their own animal, phrased in language a great deal older than any of us. You cannot make a cat do anything it has not already decided to do, and according to this fragment, that was never an accident of temperament. It was, from the very beginning, apparently the entire point. Number the sixth watch, the guide. The sixth section is the most fragmentary of the seven, surviving only in scattered signs across a badly cracked portion of the tablet, and the translator's reconstruction here is, by her own account, the most tentative of the entire document. What survives clearly enough to translate with any confidence is a short phrase describing the small ones as present at the going out, paired with signs the translator associates cautiously. With the broader Mesopotamian conception of the journey, a person's spirit was believed to undertake after death, a journey extensively documented in genuine, published Sumerian and Akkadian literature, most famously in the myth of Inanna's own descent into the underworld, a text that survives in multiple complete versions and describes, in considerable ritual detail, the passage a soul was believed to make through 7 gates before reaching the realm of the dead. The fragment's claim, to the extent it can be reconstructed at all from what survives, is that the small watcher's presence extended to this final threshold as well as to the ordinary thresholds of the household, that whatever function they performed at the doorway during a person's life, some version of that same function was believed to apply at the very last doorway of all. The text does not claim they guide the soul in the sense of actively leading it anywhere. The language, where legible, is closer to accompaniment than guidance, closer to bearing witness one final time than to performing any active ritual function. It's worth being careful here, because this is exactly the kind of claim that becomes exaggerated the more it gets repeated, and we don't want to overstate what a badly damaged 4,000-year-old fragment can actually support. What we can say with confidence, independent of this tablet entirely, is that the association between cats and the presence of death is not something this fragment invented out of nothing. It echoes a pattern that shows up repeatedly and independently across cultures with no direct connection to Sumer at all, and it echoes something that hospice workers, entirely outside any mystical framework, have reported often enough in recent decades to have become a recognized, if informally documented, pattern in end-of-life care settings, cats in households and care facilities alike, showing an uncanny tendency to seek out and remain beside people in their final hours, without any training, instruction, or reward to explain the behavior. Whether that overlap is meaningful, or simply the kind of pattern human beings are always eager to find, is a question this video is not going to answer for you. The fragment only asks you to notice that someone, 4,000 years ago, appears to have written the pattern down before it ever had a chance to become the internet-era folklore it circulates as today. Number the seventh watch, the ones who stayed. Which brings us to the final section, the one the translator's own notes single out, more than any other part of the tablet, as the reason she describes the entire fragment as a warning rather than simply a curiosity. The seventh watch, unlike the 6 before it, does not describe a task, it describes a status. The reconstructed text, drawing on the clearest surviving portion of the entire tablet, states that when the water came, the same flood event described across a wide range of genuine, extensively studied Mesopotamian sources, most famously in the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh flood narratives. Every other arrangement between the gods and the people of the earth was, in the fragment's own language, remade. This lines up directly with the account given in the K7841 fragment, which describes the post-flood period as a time of systematic restriction, in which capacities and memories that had existed freely before the flood were deliberately cycled, managed, and withheld from the general population going forward. But the seventh watch of the Ningal fragment makes a claim the K7841 fragment never quite makes about anything else in its own account. It states, in the clearest surviving line of the entire tablet, that the small ones were not remade, not bound into the new arrangement, not brought under whatever administrative system the K7841 fragment describes as having been imposed on humanity in the flood's aftermath, left in the fragment's own phrase as they were before the water. If both fragments are describing pieces of the same underlying story, and the shared sevenfold structure, the shared post-flood framework, and the explicit repeated echo between the two texts make that increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence, whatever you make of either tablet's ultimate authenticity, then this is the claim the entire video has been building toward. Humanity, according to this reconstructed tradition, walked out of the flood into a world where its own internal capacities had been deliberately altered, managed, and withheld, exactly as the 7 memories described. But something else walked out of that same flood unaltered, unmanaged, unbound by whatever new arrangement was imposed on everything and everyone else. Something that, according to this tablet, never stopped doing the one thing it had been posted here to do in the first place, because nothing that happened afterward, not the flood, not the fall of Sumer, not 5,000 years of empires rising and falling on top of the ground it still walks across every day, ever had the authority to call it off duty. That is the claim, whether you believe it is, as the translator herself apparently came to believe, a warning worth taking seriously, or simply one of the strangest and most carefully constructed pieces of speculative reconstruction to come out of this entire shadow archive of unpublished Assyriological material, is not something we're going to tell you how to decide. What we can tell you is what happened to this tablet after 2014, and why, if the pattern surrounding K7841 taught us anything, you should not be surprised that the trail, once again, appears to simply stop. Part 5, the pattern that follows. Here is what we know happened to the Ningal fragment after 2014, laid out as plainly and as carefully as the available record allows, because this is the part of the story where it becomes most important not to overstate what we can actually demonstrate. The translator who reopened the file on Fragment 41 did not publish her findings. This, on its own, is not unusual. Assyriology is a small field, working with an enormous backlog of genuinely fragmentary and difficult material, and scholars sit on partial translations for years, sometimes for the rest of their careers, waiting for a piece of comparative evidence that never arrives or simply moving on to other projects with clearer institutional support behind them. If this were the only strange thing about the fragment's recent history, it would not be worth a second thought. But it is not the only strange thing. In the 18 months following her initial 2014 examination, the tablet was moved twice between storage facilities within the same museum system. First as part of what the internal records describe only as a routine collections consolidation, and then again, less than a year later, in what the paperwork describes as a transfer necessitated by building maintenance work in the original storage wing. 2 moves in 18 months for an object that had sat undisturbed in the same drawer for nearly 4 decades before that. Neither move is individually suspicious. Museums consolidate collections, buildings require maintenance. But taken together, following directly on the heels of the first serious scholarly attention the object had received since George Smith briefly glanced at what may be the same fragment in 1875. The timing is, at minimum, the kind of coincidence that a careful researcher notes rather than dismisses. By 2016, the object's catalog entry had been updated to list its status as pending further conservation review, a designation that, under normal museum practice, typically indicates active, ongoing work, condition assessment, environmental stabilization, preparation for eventual display or research access. We contacted the museum directly in preparing this video, through the same general research inquiry channel available to any member of the public, to ask what the current status of that conservation review was, nearly a decade after it was first listed. We received a response confirming that the object remains in the conservation queue, with no estimated timeline for completion, and no current plans for public display or research access beyond the digitized 2003 photographs already on file. When we asked specifically whether any translation work on the fragment had been formally commissioned or published since 2014, the response did not directly answer the question, referring us instead to the museum's general publications list, on which Fragment 41 does not appear. We want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point in a story like this where it becomes tempting to fill a gap in institutional communication with the most dramatic possible explanation, and we don't think that serves you, the viewer, or the truth of what we're actually able to demonstrate. A pending conservation review that never resolves is not, by itself, evidence of anything beyond ordinary institutional under-resourcing. Regional university museums operate on limited budgets, with conservation departments that are frequently understaffed relative to the size of their backlogs, and it would be entirely unremarkable in isolation for a single fragmentary tablet from a minor, uncelebrated collection to simply sit in a queue indefinitely, not because anyone is hiding anything, but because nobody with the authority to prioritize it has ever had a compelling institutional reason to do so. What makes this pattern worth your attention is not any single data point. It's the shape the pattern takes when you set it beside what happened to K7841. Recall from our previous video the broad outline of that fragment's own disappearance. Translated in part by George Smith and briefly referenced by at least 3 other 19th and early 20th century scholars, Jules Oppert, Friedrich Delitzsch, and William Hayes Ward, whose surviving notes and correspondence formed the basis of that entire reconstruction, before vanishing from the British Museum's accessible collections sometime in the 1920s, its current location, existence, or fate entirely unaccounted for in any catalog we have been able to locate. A tablet identified, briefly studied, and then lost, not through any single dramatic event, but through the accumulated, unremarkable friction of storage transfers, incomplete cataloging, and scholarly attention that arrives and then, for reasons never formally explained, does not continue. Now set that beside Fragment 41, briefly noted by George Smith in 1875, in language that, on the balance of the evidence, appears to describe either this fragment or one very much like it, before disappearing from any documented scholarly attention for nearly 90 years. Rediscovered by accident in a basement in 2003, misfiled under a description that did not remotely match its actual content, sitting unexamined for a further 11 years despite having been correctly flagged as unusual at the moment of its rediscovery. Finally translated, at least in preliminary form, in 2014, and then within 18 months moved twice, formally reclassified into an indefinite conservation queue, and never again the subject of any published scholarly work by the one person who had, by her own account, come to regard it as significant enough to describe, in a private communication, as a warning. 2 tablets, different eras of rediscovery, separated by more than a century, different institutions on different continents with no formal administrative connection to one another, and in both cases the same underlying shape. Initial identification by a genuinely qualified, credentialed scholar, followed by a period of serious engagement, followed by an institutional or logistical development that ends that engagement without any formal conclusion, resolution, or publication, after which the object itself becomes, for practical research purposes, functionally inaccessible, its current status reduced to a bureaucratic phrase awaiting analysis. Pending conservation review, that could describe either genuine institutional neglect or something considerably more deliberate, and that, crucially, gives an outside observer no way to distinguish between the two. This is not, we want to stress again, proof of a coordinated suppression effort. We are not in a position to make that claim, and we would be doing you a disservice if we dressed up institutional under-resourcing as evidence of conspiracy simply because the pattern is emotionally satisfying to describe that way. What we can tell you honestly is that this specific shape, significant object, brief serious engagement, unexplained institutional friction, indefinite disappearance, recurs often enough across the handful of fragments in this shadow archive that a purely innocent explanation has to account for the recurrence itself, not just each individual case in isolation. Ordinary bureaucratic neglect happens constantly to thousands of minor artifacts in under-resourced collections around the world. What is harder to explain, if this is nothing more than ordinary neglect, is why it appears to happen so consistently, and so specifically to the small number of fragments that touch on this particular category of claim, the claim that something was taken from human beings after the flood, and the parallel claim in this second tablet that something else was deliberately left untaken. There is one more piece of this that we think is worth including, even though it sits closer to anecdote than evidence, because it comes directly from the correspondence we were able to review in preparing this video. In the same brief email exchange in which the translator described Fragment 41 as a warning she did not believe was meant to survive this long, she included one further line, which her institution's later statement characterized as an informal, personal aside not reflecting any professional or scholarly judgment. She wrote that in the months after she completed her preliminary translation of the Seventh Watch, the section describing the small ones as left unbound, unaltered, exactly as they were before the flood, she found herself, for the first time in her adult life, unable to stop noticing her own cat. Not doing anything unusual, sitting in doorways, watching rooms she wasn't in a hurry to enter, sleeping, as it always had, curled against the side of her body rather than at the foot of the bed. Nothing had changed about the animal's behavior at all. What had changed, she wrote, was that she had stopped being able to see it as ordinary. We are not going to tell you what to make of that. We include it because it is, in its own small way, the entire thesis of this video, arriving not from 4,000 years of ancient text but from a single working scholar's own household in the present day, after she had spent long enough with this material to stop being able to unsee it. Which brings us to the question this entire video has been building toward. If both of these fragments are describing pieces of the same underlying arrangement, one describing what was taken from humanity after the flood, the other describing what was deliberately left in place, unbound, to keep watch over the gap that taking created. What does it actually mean to put those two pieces together? What, according to this reconstructed tradition, were the small ones actually watching for, all this time, if not simply to protect a household from ordinary, everyday danger? That is where we have to go next, and it is where this video is finally going to answer the question its own title asks. What were cats actually sent here to do? And why, according to every scrap of this fragmentary, suppressed, and only partially recovered record, have they never once stopped doing it? Part 6. What the two tablets say together. Let's lay both fragments side by side, one final time, and look at the shape they make together, because it is only in that combination, not in either tablet read alone, that the full claim these texts appear to be making comes into focus. The K7841 fragment, as we walked through in our previous video, describes 7 memories deleted from human awareness in the aftermath of the flood. Not deleted permanently, according to that tablet's own account, but managed, cycled, withheld, distributed unevenly across the population, maintained by what the fragment describes in its final and most striking section as a kind of administrative system, dependent on keeping the number of people who had recovered their original capacities small enough that the system as a whole could continue to function. The 7th memory of that fragment is not a memory at all in the ordinary sense. It is instructions, a map, an account of how the first 6 pieces might, eventually, be reassembled by someone willing to do the work of recovery. The Ningal fragment describes something that, on the surface, looks like the opposite kind of story. Not something taken from humanity, but something given to it, small watchers, posted at the threshold, present through witness, positioned against unseen harm, close through the vulnerable hours of sleep. But the 7th watch of this second fragment reframes everything that came before it in exactly the same direction as the 7th memory of the first. It tells us that when the flood remade every other arrangement between the gods and the people of the earth, the small watchers were left unbound. Left outside whatever new administrative system was imposed on the human population going forward. Left, in other words, exactly where they had always been, at the seam, at the threshold, in witness, while everything around them, including the very capacities of the humans they were watching, was being systematically reorganized. Put these two claims together, and a considerably stranger picture starts to emerge than either fragment offers on its own. If the K7841 fragment is accurate, humanity walked out of the flood missing something, internal capacities that had existed freely before, now deleted, managed, and distributed only in careful, controlled doses to a small minority in any given generation. And if the Ningal fragment is accurate, something else walked out of that same flood completely unaltered, still positioned exactly where it had always been posted, still performing exactly the function it had always performed, watching a boundary that had existed since before the deletion ever took place. What boundary was that originally? The Ningal fragment's first watch describes it in purely domestic terms, the threshold of the dwelling, the seam between inside and outside. But if you read that description, alongside the K7841 fragment's account of what was taken from humanity after the flood, a different possibility opens up. What if the threshold the small watchers were originally posted at was never simply the doorway of a house? What if it was the same boundary the K7841 fragment describes as having been reinforced after the flood, the boundary between the capacities humans had access to before the deletion, and the diminished, managed awareness they were left with afterward? What if the small watchers, present at that threshold since before the flood ever happened, have spent every single day since simply continuing to sit at the edge of a boundary that used to be invisible, because there was nothing on the other side of it to hide, and that only became a seam worth guarding once something was placed behind it? This is, we want to be honest with you, an inference, not a direct claim either tablet makes explicitly. Neither fragment states outright that the threshold in the Ningal fragment and the missing memories in the K7841 fragment are the same boundary. What both fragments do, independently, consistently, and in a way that becomes very difficult to read as coincidental once you've spent 90 minutes walking through both of them in detail, is describe a moment, the flood, after which something was withheld from humanity, and something else was left in place, unbound, uncontrolled, positioned at exactly the kind of boundary that withholding would require someone or something to maintain. If that reading holds even approximately, it reframes every single ordinary moment you have ever spent with a cat. The freezing in the doorway is not, on this reading, a response to a draft or a smell. It is, according to this reconstructed tradition, the oldest and most literal possible description of an animal checking a seam that has existed, unchanged, since before your species lost whatever it lost in the flood, this material keeps circling back to. The unblinking stillness during a significant moment in a room is not curiosity. It is witness. In the specific, weighted sense, both fragments appear to use that word, presence, that fixes an event into a record you, personally, may never be able to access, but that the K7841 fragment insists still exists somewhere, waiting to be recovered. And the refusal to be bound, the thing every cat owner already knows and usually laughs about, the simple, stubborn impossibility of commanding a cat to do anything it has not already decided to do, is not a quirk of temperament at all, according to this tablet. It is the entire mechanism by which the small watchers were able to walk through the flood unaltered in the first place. You cannot restructure what you were never able to bind. There is one further piece of real, uncontroversial zooarchaeology worth setting alongside all of this before we close, because unlike almost everything else in tonight's video, it does not depend on any suppressed tablet, any private correspondence, or any translation nobody has been willing to publish. It is simply established fact, and it happens to point in exactly the same direction as everything the fragments claim. Cats are one of a very small number of domesticated species that were never, in the conventional sense, domesticated by human beings at all. Dogs were shaped by deliberate human selective breeding over thousands of years, bred generation after generation for specific traits, specific temperaments, specific working roles in a process directed at every stage by human choice. Cats did something different. The genuine mainstream archaeological consensus is that cats domesticated themselves, that they moved into early human granaries and settlements on their own initiative, drawn by the rodent populations that inevitably gathered wherever humans stored grain, and simply stayed on terms that were never fully dictated by the humans whose homes they entered. Humans did not go out and capture wild cats and selectively breed them into companionship the way they did with wolves. Cats walked in, uninvited, decided the arrangement suited them, and have never fully surrendered the option of walking back out. Every cat owner already knows this in the most practical, everyday sense. A dog can be trained out of nearly any instinct over enough generations through enough deliberate breeding. A cat cannot. Not because cats are less intelligent or less trainable in specific narrow tasks, they can be trained and are for very particular behaviors. But there is a core of autonomy in a domestic cat's behavior that no amount of selective breeding across 10,000 years of shared history with humanity has ever managed to fully remove, and depending on which zooarchaeologist you ask, may never have been the actual goal of that relationship in the first place. We did not build cats to serve us the way we built dogs or oxen or horses. Cats arrived already built on their own terms and simply chose, for reasons that remain genuinely debated even among mainstream researchers with no interest whatsoever in ancient tablets or suppressed archives, to keep showing up. Whether you find the Ningal fragments account of why persuasive, or whether you set the tablet aside as an elaborate, unverifiable piece of reconstructed folklore, that underlying fact remains true regardless, sitting quietly in the genuine archaeological record, independent of anything this video has told you tonight. Something did walk into the human story on its own terms, roughly 10,000 years ago, and something about it has never been fully bound since. If you have made it this far, all the way through both of these tablets, K7841 and the Ningal fragment together, then I want you to do one thing before you close this video, and it costs you nothing except a moment of your attention. Look around the room you're in right now. If there's a cat in it, look at what it's actually doing, not what you assume it's doing. What it's actually doing in this exact moment while you're hearing this. Is it sitting near a doorway? Is it watching something in the room that isn't moving? Is it positioned, without your having asked it to be, somewhere between you and the rest of the space around you? You don't have to believe any of what we've walked through tonight to notice that. The noticing is free. The fragments only ask you to consider that what you're noticing might be older and might be more deliberate than the explanation you've always defaulted to without thinking twice about it. The seventh watch of the Ningal fragment is the clearest surviving line in the entire tablet, and it is worth leaving you with one final time in the translator's own reconstructed rendering, left as they were before the water, not given. Not bound, not remade, simply left at the edge, watching a seam that the rest of us walked out of the flood no longer able to fully see. If this is the kind of material you want more of, we are not finished. The Ningal fragment ends its final surviving line with a single further phrase, badly damaged, that the translator's notes mention only in passing, and that we have deliberately not included anywhere in tonight's video, because it appears to reference a third object, a third piece of this same inheritance, that no one to our knowledge has ever publicly identified. We are already looking into it. Hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and stay close to this channel. We are going to find out what that third fragment is. And when we do, we are going to bring it straight to you, the same way we brought you the 7 memories and the same way we brought you the 7 watches tonight. We will continue the recovery. We will continue piecing together what the priests of Sumer were trying to make sure never fully disappeared. And we will keep watching, the same way something has apparently been watching all of us, quietly, from the corner of every room we have ever lived in, since long before any of us were here to notice. See you in the next video. That they moved into early human granaries and settlements on their own initiative, drawn by the rodent populations that inevitably gathered wherever humans stored grain, and simply stayed, on terms that were never fully dictated by the humans whose homes they entered. Humans did not go out and capture wild cats and selectively breed them into companionship the way they did with wolves. Cats walked in, uninvited, decided the arrangement suited them, and have never fully surrendered the option of walking back out. Every cat owner already knows this in the most practical, everyday sense. A dog can be trained out of nearly any instinct over enough generations through enough deliberate breeding. A cat cannot. Not because cats are less intelligent or less trainable in specific narrow tasks. They can be trained and are for very particular behaviors. But there is a core of autonomy in a domestic cat's behavior that no amount of selective breeding across 10,000 years of shared history with humanity has ever managed to fully remove, and depending on which zooarchaeologist you ask, may never have been the actual goal of that relationship in the first place. We did not build cats to serve us the way we built dogs or oxen or horses. Cats arrived already built on their own terms and simply chose, for reasons that remain genuinely debated even among mainstream researchers with no interest whatsoever in ancient tablets or suppressed archives, to keep showing up. Whether you find the Ningal fragment's account of why persuasive, or whether you set the tablet aside as an elaborate, unverifiable piece of reconstructed folklore, that underlying fact remains true regardless, sitting quietly in the genuine archaeological record, independent of anything this video has told you tonight. Something did walk into the human story on its own terms, roughly 10,000 years ago, and something about it has never been fully bound since. If you have made it this far, all the way through both of these tablets, K7841 and the Ningal fragment together, then I want you to do one thing before you close this video, and it costs you nothing except a moment of your attention. Look around the room you're in right now. If there's a cat in it, look at what it's actually doing, not what you assume it's doing. What it's actually doing in this exact moment while you're hearing this. Is it sitting near a doorway? Is it watching something in the room that isn't moving? Is it positioned, without your having asked it to be, somewhere between you and the rest of the space around you? You don't have to believe any of what we've walked through tonight to notice that. The noticing is free. The fragments only ask you to consider that what you're noticing might be older and might be more deliberate than the explanation you've always defaulted to without thinking twice about it. The 7th watch of the Ningal fragment is the clearest surviving line in the entire tablet, and it is worth leaving you with one final time in the translator's own reconstructed rendering, left as they were before the water, not given. Not bound, not remade, simply left at the edge, watching a seam that the rest of us walked out of the flood no longer able to fully see. If this is the kind of material you want more of, we are not finished. The Ningal fragment ends its final surviving line with a single further phrase, badly damaged, that the translator's notes mention only in passing, and that we have deliberately not included anywhere in tonight's video, because it appears to reference a third object, a third piece of this same inheritance, that no one to our knowledge has ever publicly identified. We are already looking into it. Hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and stay close to this channel. We are going to find out what that third fragment is. And when we do, we are going to bring it straight to you, the same way we brought you the 7 memories and the same way we brought you the 7 watches tonight. We will continue the recovery. We will continue piecing together what the priests of Sumer were trying to make sure never fully disappeared, and we will keep watching, the same way something has apparently been watching all of us, quietly, from the corner of every room we have ever lived in, since long before any of us were here to notice. See you in the next video.